All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started here. I'm going to turn it over to Jasenia first, and then and I'll come back and do some of the rest of the education here. But Jasenia Rivera is our program director for the DC program.
Thank you, Corey. So as Corey said, my name is Jasenia Rivera, and I am the director for the DC program. I've been with Solar United Neighbors for almost 3 years now. And we're very excited to be trying out something new. We're known for our co-ops, but this year we're trying out a group purchase program where basically you get that same level of education and attention from us, but we're not requesting proposals from installers. You're going out there and getting the proposals yourself, but we're helping you understand those proposals and walking you through the process, even like what kind of questions to ask from installers, what to look for in these proposals, so that you can then make a choice that works for you. So thank you all for coming in today's meeting. I've gone ahead and I think I gave everyone permission to speak. So if you have any questions at any point, feel free to raise your hand, put it in the chat, or speak out. Like Corey said, he's going to be doing the presentation today, but I'll be here monitoring the chats and answering questions. So hopefully you get a lot out of this presentation today. Handing it back to Corey.
Thanks, Jasenia. So this presentation will probably take about 45 minutes, maybe a little longer, depending on questions. Definitely want to make it as interactive as possible, so feel free, as Jasenia said, to stop us and ask questions along the way. I'm going to cover, so the content of this, which I'll go over a little bit more in detail, is really like solar technology basics, economics of solar, incentives, and then a little bit more about this Go Solar group that we're doing in DC, so you can see what that looks like. So let's go ahead and get started, and encourage everybody to chat questions if you'd like, or just speak up. A little bit of, I know most of us probably speak Zoom these days in our current times, but in case you need a little bit of a refresher, the little icon here on the left for joining the audio, you can mute yourself, obviously. If you do have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat, or as I said, you can speak up. You can also raise your hand if you like, just saying we'll be keeping an eye out for that. We do want to let people know that this webinar is being recorded, so we'll be posting this later. So just keep that in mind. If you want to, keep yourself quiet and off the presentation, you're welcome to do that, but totally up to you. We just want to make sure folks know that. A little bit about us as an organization. So Solar United Neighbors is a nonprofit. We are essentially helping people go solar through all over the country. We have programs in a couple different 13 states right now. And we help people go solar by providing direct support to them through a variety of different ways, like our solar co-ops, like this Go Solar group. And ultimately, what we're doing is building a network of people who are familiar with how solar works, that benefit from it directly, and ultimately, hopefully are willing to advocate for expanding access to solar so that as many people can go solar as possible in the communities where they live. How we got started right here in DC. For folks that don't know us as well, this was back in 2007. Our executive director, Anya Schoolman, tried to go solar on her own. Her son, who's here on the left, and his friend on the right, wanted to decide to go solar, and they did some research, realized that it was kind of complicated back then. It's not anymore, excuse me. And what they did was to say, let's just do this together as a group. Let's provide some support for each other. Let's talk to installers and ask the right questions together. And what that was really the starting point for work that we now do all over the country. And that work happens in the states you see here, but we also have some national offerings that we put together for people through what we call our membership program. So the membership program allows anybody to go solar anywhere in the country to become a paying Solar United Neighbors member and get support. For places where we do organized groups, like in some of these states, it's a different process. And if you're familiar with our work in the past in DC, you'll certainly remember the co-ops that we've run here. This program is a little bit different, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the presentation, but the idea is still the same, which is that we are essentially helping people figure out what to do, make the process a little easier, a little less obscure for people who have not gone solar before, provide some education in a timely way, provide some support for questions that people have, not only from us, but also from their peers, and be a resource along the way to make sure that everything goes smoothly. This presentation is going to be in 3 parts tonight. I'm going to talk first about solar technology. We're really just going to make sure everybody has sort of the same level set of information about how solar works. And then we'll talk a little bit about the solar group. And finally, economics, what the costs are in rough terms, so you have a sense of that, and the incentives that are involved specifically in DC. Excuse me. And then at the end, we'll leave some space for question and answers. If you have questions that you didn't get answered during the presentation, we'll stick online as long as you need. We'll answer every question you have, and if we don't have an answer, we'll get back to you and make sure that we can get one for you. First up, solar technology. I'll start off by saying, and I'll point this out a little bit later too, I'm also a solar owner. I live in the Capitol Hill area of Washington, DC. I installed solar on my house back in 2012 through a company that I used to work for. So I used to work for a solar installation company and did that as part of my work there before coming to work here at Solar United Neighbors. We're going to talk a little bit about the definitions and some of the components first before we get into kind of putting all the pieces together. Generally speaking, you've got, excuse me, generally speaking, what we're talking here about is solar photovoltaics. You may be aware of solar hot water. That is a different technology, and we're focused in this group and broadly for Solar United Neighbors on photovoltaics, which is taking sunlight, converting it to electricity, and then feeding into your home so that your home can use that electricity, and in some cases, feeding it back out to the grid, which we'll talk about a little bit later. This picture here is just to give you a general sense. I'm going to come back to this in a couple of slides, so to put it all together, but just so you can have a general idea of the components involved. Solar is a pretty simple technology when it comes down to it. There's no moving parts, and what you're doing is really taking a series of modules, solar modules that are usually going to be on your roof, although it could be on the ground as well. You're feeding that through one or more inverters that's switching that electricity to a form that your house can use. And then you're feeding it into your electric panel where you'll power some or all of your loads depending on how much electricity you're using. And you'll pass some of that potentially out to the street through your electric meter. So that's the general flow you'll see here. And as I said, we'll come back to this again and provide some more detail after we've put some of the components together. Let's talk a little bit about terminology. You'll hear us talk about two separate terms here. Kilowatts and kilowatt hours. It's important to distinguish between the two, especially when you're doing shopping, because you will see both of these terms on proposals. The kilowatts are really the measurement of the system's size. So think of it as the rated capacity of the array and how much it can produce. That's going to mean that your system and how big your array is going to vary from your neighbors or for somebody else in the group. And that's a reflection of a couple different things. One, how much electricity you use in your house. Two, how much space you have. And three, how much energy, excuse me, what your budget is. So how much you're willing to finance or to pay up front to be able to pay for a system. All of those things produce a system size in kilowatts that lets you cover some or all of your electricity needs. Most system sizes in the city are going to be somewhere between 2 is relatively small up into about maybe 7 or 8 kilowatts. You'll see bigger systems. This range here, 12 kilowatts, that encompasses most of the size range for an array. What that system produces, just how much electricity it produces, it depends on the location of the array, how much sun is hitting it during the day. All of these are specific to your home. So it's very much custom to where your home is, which way the roof is sited, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and then whether there's any shading and things involved. So your system, which is rated in kilowatts, is going to produce kilowatt hours. And those are the units that are on your electricity bill. That's the energy that you're using in your home. And that's ultimately what you're offsetting to reduce your cost of electricity with the utility company. So those are going to be, those are some terms that we'll be coming back to. Just want to make sure that you hear those. Looks like we've got a question here.
No question,
Russ.
just a
no
comment
question.
from Russ.
Okay, cool, right on. So first up, again, for the components, the panels, very simple components here. Typically, it's an aluminum frame. You've got silicon modules. Those are the solar cells that are all connected together. And then you've got some encapsulants and some glass and a back sheet. And these are all built to be able to support a lot of wear and tear in the outside environments, right? They're tested to be outside in harsh conditions. And these are going to be connected together in a series, as you can see on the right, and they're connected electrically together to make a larger system. The inverter is really the brains of the system, and this technology is what's converting that electricity, which is coming off of the modules in DC or direct current, and converting it into AC or alternating current. The types of inverters, your installer is really going to help you figure that out and design that for the conditions on your home. But there's three main categories that you just want to be aware of when you're looking at your options. One is a string inverter, and that's a single unit that does all of the conversion for the entire array. You see this more where there's hardly any shade or any shade on a system, where they put a single unit in place and those modules produce, and they're all sort of connected together like a Christmas tree. But when there's shading involved and some part of the array might be shaded, a string inverter may not perform as optimally. So in some cases, you also can't see the module by module production with a string inverter. So a lot of times you'll see, and this is true in DC as well, that the installers are usually going to offer some sort of what they call module level or panel level optimization. All that means is there's a unit that's up underneath the module, and it's taking care of either the whole conversion or part of the conversion to AC electricity. So the one in the middle, this string inverter with optimizers, you've got a brains unit that's somewhere down on the ground, mine's in my basement, and then some units on the modules that sort of work together to make sure that each module produces the most that it can, even if its modules next to it are shaded partially. The microinverters are similar, except they're doing that entire conversion under the module. So there's no ground-based unit for microinverters. And these are all options that you'll see installers offer, and they're gonna offer typical components that they would suggest. Oftentimes you have some flexibility to request a different one if you have a brand preference, but those are the brains of the system, and they're gonna show you also the monitoring and your energy output, which we'll show later. Next is the electrical components. So this is how it connects to your house. It's a pretty simple connection. It is usually going to go, that output from your inverter is usually going to go just into your main electric panel, usually goes at the bottom of the panel. And that's where it feeds that electricity in so the rest of your house can use that, that solar energy. Sometimes it might connect out near your meter, but most of the time it's going to go into your main panel. So if your panel is in pretty good shape, if it's your house or your panel is older than say like the late 70s, 1970s, you're going to be fine. For some older houses in the city, you might need to upgrade your panel, especially if you have those like old round glass fuses. They're going to need to do some work. But for most modern electric panels, you're not going to need to do any work. And the installers can do that as part of the cost of the system. When they do their proposals, they'll propose that as well. Next up, racking, super important. So this is how the system attaches to your roof. I'm going to go into a couple different types here. This is particularly important for DC because there are a lot of different types of racking that are possible in a DC home. The one on the left, this flashing here, is for pitched roofs. So if you have a shingle roof, asphalt shingle in particular, and other types potentially as well, they're going to put a piece of metal, it's usually aluminum, that's going to go up underneath the flashings to prevent the water from going into the penetration that they use to attach that attachment point to the roof. So it sheds off just like it would if it were a shingle, and that's how they waterproof those attachments. That becomes the base for your array, which each one of those is a place where they can attach a rail that will that provides the structure for the array. A ballasted system is just like it says, it's with weighted blocks. Most of the time in a home, you're not going to see that, but if you have a particularly new home and it's got a lot of roof support, then this may be an option for you. Standoffs and beams, I'll have a picture of this later, but this is very common, and this is when they put aluminum beams between the party walls on a flat roof home, and then they put the modules on top. Same thing is true with clamps. I'll also have a picture of this later on, where if you have a standing seam metal roof, as long as those seams are in good shape, they can a lot of times take clamps and put them on. They grasp very tightly to the seam, and they provide a structure that doesn't require any sort of roof penetration. And the last, pitch pockets, which is a common roofing technique where they're making a connection to a rafter point and then filling it with some sealant to make sure that it doesn't leak. So these are all options. Your installer is going to recommend what they think is best for you. It is important just to make sure you understand what they're recommending and make sure you're comfortable with how they're going to go about doing that. So here's an example of a standing seam metal roof. This is my roof, installed in 2012. So I replaced my roof with a standing seam metal roof and then installed this the following year. So this is a 3.15 kilowatt system, and that's been in service since 2012 with no problems. This next one is an example of what you might see for a flat roof beam system. So you can see these beams that are sitting on the party wall here. I'm just gonna make a little note. These guys. The attachment points to the party wall are going to vary by installer and how they do that. So it's really important to have them describe to you how they're going to go about making those attachments. But what that does is it sits on top, so it's not penetrating your main roof, They will make some attachment points onto your party wall though, and that provides a stable structure for them to put their modules on top. Let me just clear that out. Clear drawings. Sorry about that. My cursor decided to disappear. Next up, ground mounted, probably not applicable for DC, but they look super cool. And if you know anybody who has the space, this is also a great way to go solar. Perfectly fine for a home as long as it works for your zoning area. So what makes a good roof for solar in general? I talked a little earlier about how the shading and the roof issues need to be taken into consideration. In DC and this area, generally speaking, if you have a roof that is facing east, south, or west, they can put solar on there and it's going to produce pretty well. In DC for flat roofs, all roofs and it's low slope roofs in DC, they all incline a little bit, like 5 degrees. You can put solar on a roof that is flat, that's slightly sloping northward. It's going to produce less than if it were sloping southward, but the economics still work out. So if you have a flat roof and it's gently sloping to the north in DC, that's usually going to be okay. Some installers might even tilt the modules up, but generally speaking, they're going to be flush with the roof. So just have that conversation with your installers. If you have a pitched roof, the north roof is definitely not someplace you want to put solar because the sun needs to be able to strike those modules directly in order to produce electricity. And if it's facing the north, there aren't too many times a year where that's going to happen, except maybe the very, very extreme summer. So also important are shading on your roof. If you've got a chimney that's casting shade or vent pipes and things like that, that's something they can work around. And that's where those different types of inverters come into play that I mentioned. But generally speaking, you want to have good solar resource hitting your roof between the hours of 9 and 3 during the day. 9 and 3, 9 and 4. I'm not going to talk too much about batteries, but I do want to mention it here because it gets a lot of interest, and it is certainly something we see more and more that are being adopted, especially in places where the utility power is not as reliable. But what happens when the power goes out? For a lot of these systems installed in DC, unless you have batteries, your solar array is not going to produce electricity when the power is out. And the reason is that they don't want that electricity flowing into the grid while people are repairing the lines. So in order to have your system work, you need to add batteries to it. Most of the time, people are not adding batteries unless they have some really important loads at home. They might be at the end of a long utility line in the suburbs somewhere, and their power goes out, and they just don't want to deal. So they might install, or if they have critical medical needs at home, perhaps, or just general emergency preparedness. In the city, most of the lines are underground, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend getting storage unless you're in a part of the city that has above ground lines and you actually have regular outages, which is not that common in DC. But we do want to just make sure that folks know that solar and storage are a really great combination for folks that are interested in that. And just to give you sort of a brief example here, what you're doing with battery storage, if you were to install it, is really covering loads that are not the whole house, but important ones, what they call critical loads. So you would pick those with the installer. They would put your all those circuits into a special box, and they would run just that part of your house on the batteries while the rest of your house is off when the power goes out. But again, very unlikely in DC you're going to do that. We do just want to make sure people know that. If you're interested in nerding out and read all about storage, we've got a great storage guide that you see the link for here. We put that out a couple years ago. It gets a lot of interest, and there's a way more info there about the general costs and dynamics of installing solar and storage and things to keep in mind. So check that resource out if you want to ask more. And you can always contact us directly by email or contact us at dcteam@solarunitedneighbors.org, and we're happy to answer your questions there. All right, so let's put this all together again. We got this diagram that we've used earlier in the day, earlier in the presentation, and I'm gonna review the way that it works. And I'm also gonna give you an example here. So what we're doing really is when we put all these components together, the sun is striking those modules, and number one, that electricity in DC form is flowing into your inverter, number two, and then is going into your house loads, powering something in your house, and if there's any left over, it goes out to the street. So what does that look like in reality? First, let's say on Sunday you are at home, you're running the air conditioning, you're doing a bunch of stuff in the house, sun's out, and you're making tons of electricity. That electricity is going to go through the path you see here, and it's going to probably get used right up on the spot in number 3 there in your electric panel. You're just going to use it as soon as you make it. Monday rolls around, you are at work, I know we all work from home now, but bear with me. You're away out of the house, you're still producing a lot of electricity, but you're not using as much. In this case, that electricity is going to go flow through that same path, but rather than get used in number 3, it's going to go through your electric meter and you're going to get a credit for it. That credit has a value, which I'm going to go over in the next couple slides, but you're going to register that credit and then you're going to use that later before you buy more electricity from the utility company. So the Monday night rolls around, you're back home, you're running your AC again, you're doing stuff, but you're not making electricity anymore because the sun's down. You're going to start to pull electricity through the grid and through your meter, but you're going to use those credits before you buy more electricity. So over the course of the year, you're making energy, using energy, making credits, using credits, and you're doing that over and over again. And that nets out to be some percentage of your total energy usage. How much depends on, again, how much space you have in your roof, how much your electricity usage is, because you might use more than your neighbor or less, even though you have the same roof size, and what your budget is. Those are all going to come together and figure out what size system is going to work for you. So what is net metering? Let's go back into this a little bit here. So you've got 1 kilowatt hour produced is equals 1 kilowatt hour consumed. That means that when you are generating electricity, you're going to use that electricity on site, but that if you're producing a kilowatt hour, you're going to get the same value of that kilowatt hour when you need it again in the future. So the utility company is keeping track of that. In the old days with those analog meters, the meter used to spin backwards, which frankly was kind of cool. And now it's just a arrow because we have all digital meters that just sort of points backwards. But the result is the same for you. And the result is that you're going to get the credit. The utility company is aware, and they're going to apply those credits later on when you're using electricity. You're going to make more credits potentially, by the way, usually in April and May when it's cool and you're producing a lot of electricity, but you're not using a lot of air conditioning, and sometimes in September and October. In the summer, most people are cranking out a lot of electricity, but they're also energy, but they're also using a lot of it at the same time. So over the course of the year, you might make more in one month and make less credits. You might make more credits and use them up, but over the course of the year, it averages out to some percentage of your total electricity usage. Really, that just comes down to how much electricity did I use in a month and how much did I produce. Whatever's left over is your net. And then you'll use that the next month. And at the end of the year, it's the same idea. Those credits will stay on your bill and roll over if you overproduce. In most cases in DC, it's going to be tough to overproduce because we just don't have enough roof space. But if you do happen to overproduce and you're making more than you're using, a little bit more, then you can use those credits later on your utility bill in a future year. The rules right now generally restrict people from installing more than 100% of their electricity usage, but those are changing in the next couple of years to go up. So you will be able to produce more, but right now it's about 100%. Pause just for a second here. I'm gonna take a little sip of water. So got a little example, mostly just to show some of the impacts. Your bill doesn't necessarily look like this, but what you're doing is you are meaningfully changing the number of kilowatt hours that you're being charged for. You remember kilowatt hours are the energy you're paying for on your bill, and you're reducing that. Now, is your bill gonna be zero? Probably not, because you can't necessarily produce everything you need, but also because there's a fixed charge from the utility. You always pay a connection charge. In DC, I think it's around $14. So that amount is always gonna be there. But your usage is what you're trying to reduce so that you're saving that money. And that's where a lot of the savings comes from, which I'll talk about a little later. So some frequently asked questions. This is sort of a catch-all slide, but there's a lot of good info here. One, warranties. For warranties on the system, you've got 3 different types of warranties to think about. One is the product warranties. So your modules and your inverters both have a product warranty, and that's going to vary from somewhere between 10 to 25 years. Modules usually are like 10 to 12 years, but they do make some that have come with a 25-year warranty. Inverters also usually 10 to 12 years. Some come with a 20-year extended warranty, and those in microinverters and optimizers are usually warranted for up to 25 years. So that's for defects, manufacturer defects. If something happens, the manufacturer is going to replace that. Doesn't matter if your installer goes out of business, as long as the manufacturer is around, they're going to replace that while it's under the product warranty. Whether you pay for the cost of the labor to replace it then it's a question you want to ask your installer. But generally speaking, the product equipment is replaced for free. The second is a production warranty. So a production warranty is going to be the energy that you make from the modules, that it is guaranteed to be a certain amount each year. Modules sort of their energy production goes down ever so slightly year after year, so that at the end of 20 to 25 years, that production warranty says this module is still going to produce a certain amount of electricity based on its original rated capacity. So that's the production warranty, and the installer can help you exercise that if for some reason your system starts underperforming and they determine it's the modules that are not doing their job. And then the last one, which is also really important, is the installation or workmanship warranty. So that's the warranty that your installer is going to give to you on the work they did to assemble all those parts in the system. So that's their electrical work, their work on the roof, including roof penetrations. When you're talking to an installer, you want to just make sure you understand what their warranty covers, how long it is, as well as some specifics about how they handle any sort of roof penetration issues. Most of the time, there's no problems. I've had my solar installed for a long time. We hear from homeowners all the time that they generally don't run into issues. But if you do have a problem, you just want to make sure you understand what the installer is willing to do to address any issues that may come up. Next is homeowners insurance. Most of the time we see there's not an impact, it's neutral, but we really encourage you to call your insurance company ahead of time, make sure they know that you're installing solar, and see whether they need to make a change to your policy or even just make a note of it. Some cases we've seen it go up. From some people have reported that. We've also seen folks report that it goes down because the company might have a climate commitment, for example. So that is also worth asking about when you call. Maintenance, as I said, there's no moving parts. It's pretty low maintenance. We do recommend that somebody check your system out every couple years. In DC, we notice periodically that in some places, if there's a lot of squirrel activity or critter activity, you might see some wire damage. So you definitely want to make sure somebody has eyes on your system, probably every 3 to 5 years, make sure things look good and that everything's working okay. And installers can help you with that. If you need recommendations on or suggestions on how to go about doing that, we can certainly do that, help you there as well. You can also at the beginning, if you think you have a lot of critter issues, you can also install something called a squirrel guard or a critter guard with your array to protect. We see that in more suburban areas with some tree cover around, but it's worth asking if you know you've got some activity on your roof. The modules don't really require any cleaning. Generally speaking, if you have a flat roof, you may want to have somebody clean them off, but mostly the water is going to clean them off. You're not going to need to shovel the snow off of them or anything like that. It generally will shed that off on its own. So there's not a lot of direct work that you need to do to keep the system in operating order, other than take a look at your monitoring periodically. You're going to get a monitoring portal that comes with this that's going to tell you how much energy you're producing. It's a good idea to keep an eye on that and make sure you know what that looks like. I've had mine since 2012, and it's amazing how consistent it produces energy. Some years it might be more, some years it might be less, but if you look across the entire life of the system, it produces pretty well and consistent on a yearly basis. How long do these systems last? 20 to 25 years typically is what we say in the industry. There are systems out there that have lasted longer, but generally speaking, 20 to 25 years of it up there producing electricity for you. HOAs, in DC, there are some protections for this, but you do want to make sure that you talk to your homeowners association, your HOA, if you have one, ahead of time, and make sure you understand what those implications are for you when you're applying to go solar, if they have an approval process, excuse me, and how that works. What if I'm in a historic district? A lot of folks are in historic districts in DC. I'm in one as well. Generally speaking, if they can't see it from the street, you're fine. If you have solar on your roof that is visible from the street, or it could be, they're going to need to make some changes there. The installer is going to work through that with you. But for the most part, you do want to make sure that in a historic district that the array is not visible from the street, so that, that they'll go through the permitting process and approve that. Pardon me for just 1 second. Excuse me. Okay. So as I said, for the historic district, your installer will take care of that, but it's a good thing to be aware of ahead of time. Okay, I'm going to pause there just ever so briefly. If anybody has any questions, this would be a good time to ask them out loud or type them into the chat. Does anybody have any questions before I keep going?
No questions in the chat yet, but like Corey said, you can type them in, you can raise your hand, you can unmute yourself. Feel free to ask questions. That's what we're here for.
Super. Well, let's keep going. All right, so Jasenia mentioned at the beginning, the Go Solar group, this is something that is brand new in DC. Rather than have a co-op where everybody gets proposals together, what we're doing essentially is making it so that everybody can get their own proposal, but we're providing that same support for you. So we've structured this the way that we do for what we call our Go Solar membership offering, which is $85. It's the same thing, but we're actually adding some stuff onto that. One is this 8 weeks to solar ready content. So what that is for the first week, we send you a list. If you go to the link that Jasenia just chatted there, we actually have a little outline of what the content is. The first 7 days, we're going to give you sort of an email a day to make sure you've got the basics, and then we're going to switch to once a week. And then once a week after that, from week 2 to week 8, we're giving you information that's intended to sort of guide you along as you're going solar. So we'll give you info about how solar works, which a lot of this we're covering here. But then after that, we're going to make sure you have some ideas about where to look for installers to get proposals. When you talk to them, what questions to ask. When you get your proposals back, how to evaluate them and what to look at. And if you'd like, we also will do our proposal comparison service. So for up to 3 proposals, we'll take what you've gotten back from the installers, we'll compare them side by side, make some notes, make sure you have some idea of the questions to ask and things that stand out to us, and then set up some time to talk through that with you before you go back and try to figure out how to narrow down what you're looking for. And then at the end of those 8 weeks, we'll also talk a little bit about how the installation process works to make sure you've got some idea of what is coming. So that at the end of this 8-week period, if you're following along, you should have selected an installer, signed a contract, and you're ready to go and start installing solar. All on the way, we're here for questions. We also have a private listserv that's set up for people who are in the group so they can support each other, as well as some solar ambassadors. These are people who have gone solar in the city already, who've generously agreed to answer questions as well. After all of this, we'll still be around answering questions all the way through to past install. You'll have a 1-year membership with Solar United Neighbors. And at any point along the way, if you need support, you have questions, you can always consider us a resource for that. Our goal here really is to make this flexible, but also a guided process for folks who are going solar, and ultimately produce as many folks who are able to connect with installing solar in the city, because it is a very good deal, which you'll see in a couple slides. So just to summarize for you, timely guidance, peer support, that detailed proposal comparison, as well as connecting with some fellow solar enthusiasts. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, for folks who really want to work on expanding access to solar, we also have a whole suite of sort of advocacy and education work that we do outside of this Go Solar type of work. So if you want to join, feel free to go to that link right there. There's a simple form that asks you a bunch of questions. When you join the group, we'll take a look at your roof. We'll send you a welcome email, and then you'll get a number of contacts from us just to kick everything off, as well as all the content we talked about. So let's get to solar economics. I love this slide just because it demonstrates really the impact of some of the things that came into place in around the 2010 timeframe with the federal tax credit, which we'll talk a little bit later about, and also the increasing volume of solar. So what that in terms of installations, and that's both residential, but also commercial and utility scale. All of that production has driven a nice decline in costs because equipment has gotten less expensive. They're producing more of it. You can see over the last couple of years, it's leveled off a little bit. That's partially because of tariffs, partially because of some changes to policy. Excuse me. But ultimately, that cost will continue to decline sort of little by little, year over year, as the industry gets better at doing the things that aren't equipment related. So finding customers, educating customers, and really dealing with permitting and all of those things.
Hey, Corey, we have a question in the chat. If you can talk a little bit about the panel efficiency and how that can impact the economics and the SRAC return.
Yep, great question. So the question about panel efficiency, in DC in particular, this is an important question because the roof space that you have available is limited. So you may choose to get a higher rated panel in terms of the watts per square foot that it can produce. So think of, you have a limited space. If you put a higher efficiency set of modules in there, you're going to be able to have a larger system size in a smaller area. That's going to produce more kilowatt hours, which produces more electricity savings, as well as producing more SRECs, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, that have a lot of value. And in return for that, you're paying a higher cost for equipment. So they do, most installers, probably all installers, have a couple different tiers of modules. There's sort of the basic module that you can get. There's usually an American-made option for folks that have that want to support a U.S. manufactured panel, and then you should frequently have one or more high production or high efficiency modules. So great question, and it does in fact translate quite a bit into the value of the system and the SREX, which we'll talk about in a little bit. First, let's talk about the tax credit. For folks that are not familiar, there is a federal tax credit that is a non-refundable credit off of the system cost. Now we're in 2020. That tax credit for systems completed before the end of the year is 26% of the installed system cost. I'm going to have an example of this in the next slide, so I won't do any additional examples here. But you should know that that tax credit is currently set to decline to 22% for systems that installed next year, and then for residential systems to 0 in 2022. It's a federal policy, so it could change, but right now we just want to make sure folks understand that it is a tax credit that's going away. So let's get to a pricing example. I'm going to pause here again. Sorry, my voice is scratchy all of a sudden. Okay, so I'm going to be working on the left column, which is the 4 kilowatt column. And you'll see that this $3 a watt, which is the price, that's sort of an average for DC, depending on how you install your system. So the racking that they use and the efficiency of the modules, that price is going to go up or down. So if you have a beam-based system, like I mentioned, it takes more materials. There's going to probably be an additional cost there. If you have high efficiency modules, you might see a higher cost as well. This also depends on the installer. But roughly speaking, we use this for round math.
Hey, Corey, sorry. There's a question from Zach on if your roof is old and needs to be replaced, can the tax credit be applied to the total cost of roof replacement and solar? I believe new guidelines just came out from the IRS. It says, nope, you can no longer include roof repairs, even if they're structural, into the tax credit. Am I right?
Yep, that is correct. Yeah, it was a gray area for a long time, but they specifically ruled on that in their, well, mentioned that in their FAQ, so it is now clear. Just any, if you have a chance, if you go to our, and if folks want to look at this as well, if you go to the incentives page for our website, you'll see some references there. But yeah, unfortunately, that is not.
Yeah, I'll put the link in a minute.
Cool. So from this example, that $12,000, that's your starting point. That's what you'd pay up front or finance through a loan. If you're going that route, if you're owning the system. And we'll talk about power purchase agreements and stuff in a couple of slides for folks that are familiar with that third-party ownership model, and I'll explain that more in a little bit. That 26% federal tax credit, that comes back whenever you file your taxes. So February, March, April, you'll submit a really basic form. It's not too hard to fill out. If you use TurboTax, that's the way I did it, or your tax preparer can do it for you. The only help you need, the only documentation you need is that paid in full invoice that shows how much you paid for the system. Next is the solar renewable energy credits. Solar renewable energy credits are a really important part of the economics in DC. They're extremely valuable. And what this is the green value of the electricity. So the district has laws in place, and a number of states do, that establish what's called a renewable portfolio standard. What that means is that there are requirements for how much electricity, in this case, locally produced solar electricity, the utility has to provide. If they're not providing it themselves, they can also buy credits. These credits, or solar renewable energy credits, have an open market value, and that value fluctuates, so there's some risk involved. But they also have a structure for sort of the maximum amount that you can pay for one of those credits. So that creates a market for being able to sell those for yourself. So for this 4 kW system, just for reference, what we're showing here is if you were going to take every credit that this generated over the entire life of the system, or that 15 years, and sold it to someone else up front. For just for reference, a 4 kilowatt system is going to make around roughly 5 credits a year. Each credit is 1,000 kilowatt hours. So they call it, one credit is 1,000 kilowatt hours, or 1 megawatt hour credit is equal to that. So that number of credits, each one of those you can sell one at a time, or you can sell them at a pre-negotiated price, which they call an annuity contract, or you can sell them up front, as we're showing here. DC, I think some brokers may not offer this upfront option anymore. Excuse me. We show this because it's sort of the least beneficial, most conservative view, which is I don't want to take any of the risk. I just want to give them to somebody else and I'll take the cash. There are also financing models available from some providers where you sign these over to the provider. You still own the system, but they take them and you get a discounted price directly to the installer. Just be aware that these credits are valuable when you sell them one at a time. Right now, each credit is worth about $400 to $450 roughly. When you sell them,
about $440 right now.
When you sell them on the spot market. So for my system, which is only a 3.1 kilowatt system, I make about 4 credits a year. My broker sells them for me. They just deposit a check in my account, and that's part of the value of the system. Those credit values are going to go down over time because that's the way the incentive is structured. But DC has a very aggressive timeline for portfolio standard for producing in-state solar, as well as just solar renewable energy in general. So that keeps the values up and is a really important incentive. So if you decide to sell those credits up front, just make sure you understand what you're giving up in terms of the value over time. Generally speaking, if you can keep them and sell them one at a time, we recommend that you do that because you're going to maximize that revenue stream.
Hey, Corey, if you don't mind, I always like to point out, for example, I live 5 minutes from the district. I live in Capitol Heights. My system produces about 10 credits a year. If I were to sell those in the district, we're talking about $4,400. Because I live on the Maryland side of the border and I'm not on a feeder, it's $75 right now. So $750 for my credits versus $4,400 in DC. That's why we say if you can keep them and sell them on a one-to-one basis, you're going to get a lot more money out of them.
Yeah, exactly. So those credits, as you can see, are a pretty significant part of the economics for a system. The other part, which is something that will just keep on producing year after year, are the electricity savings. So that's what you're seeing in the bottom part of this, that estimated year 1 electricity savings. That's how much you're not paying to the utility. We generally assume with these estimates that the cost of electricity is going to go up a little bit over time, but not too aggressively from the utility. But keep in mind, over the last, I think, 5 years or so, the cost of electricity has been relatively flat in DC. Nevertheless, what your energy is you're producing, you're not paying that on your utility bill. So if your utility bill used to be, mine used to be about $100, $120 a month in the summertime, and now it's about $40. That money adds up over time, and that's also what's driving your savings. Excuse me. Once your system is paid for and you've recovered everything you've invested into it, it's just up there producing free electricity for you at that point. Which, by the way, is also a really great selling point if you're selling your home, because the cost to operate your house is less than your neighbor's house because of solar. Let's talk a little bit about financing. There are a lot of financing options out there. You can always source your own financing through a credit union or through a bank of your choice. Those are just standard loans. You do want to just make sure if you're choosing financing, you can do a secured or an unsecured loan. Obviously, the unsecured ones are going to have a higher rate in most cases. There are also solar specific loans available, which just means that that tax credit that you get back, sometimes they will loan that amount to you for a short period of time, 12 to 18 months, at a low or no % interest, but you have to pay it off before that rate balloons. And then the rest of what's left over from that loan amount can get stretched out over 5, 10, 15 years. How long you stretch it out really is up to you. Just keep in mind that if you have a longer loan period, your energy savings on a monthly basis and your SREC income should cover the cost of that, but you want to make sure that it does. If you have a shorter loan period, just like with any other loan, you're paying less in financing charges and your overall economics are going to be better, but you might be paying more for the loan in the short term. So just make sure that you understand the trade-offs there. Excuse me. And then the last one for loans, home equity line of credit. If you do go this route, if you're able to tap your equity or you already have a line open, because this is a home improvement, you can take that that interest is tax deductible if you decide to do that. That's what I did back in 2012, and then I used the SREC income and the energy savings to pay that off over time. Third-party ownership, I mentioned this earlier. There are a couple of these options in the city. Excuse me, this is when somebody else owns the system and they are owning it and operating it, and you're essentially just giving them your roof access. In the case of a power purchase agreement, you are paying for the electricity that that system produces, and hopefully paying at a lower rate than what you would have paid the utility company. And then for a lease, you are paying on a monthly basis at a fixed amount, and you're getting all the electricity as part of that lease payment. Some things to keep in mind if you're looking at those options, and you'll find this information on our website as well, which is, and first I should say, we're agnostic to financing. All these options work for people. It just really depends on your circumstances. If you're doing third-party ownership, just make sure you understand what the options are when you sell the home, because you'll need to deal with that when you do. You can oftentimes buy the system out. You can transfer it to the new owner, or in some cases, you might even be able to move the system to your new home, depends on the provider. Just read your agreement ahead of time, make sure you understand that. There's gonna be something on your house, typically on your title, called a fixture filing, UCC1 fixture filing, which just means that it's an alert for somebody that there's property installed that's owned by somebody else. So you wanna make sure you leave time to sort of work through that. Second, warranties. So what are the warranties that are included with the system when it's owned by somebody else, and how long do they last? Ideally, you want those warranties to last the entire length of the agreement, which is usually 10 to 20 years, including roof penetrations and things like that. So any of the workmanship stuff, it's possible that those workmanship warranties last less than the full term of the loan, of the agreement. Make sure you understand what your obligations are when those warranties run out in terms of something that happens to the system. So just good idea to ask those questions ahead of time. And then last, you want to make sure that you understand whether there's an escalator charge. So if you let's say, for example, you have a power purchase agreement and you are now you paid Pepco 10 cents a kilowatt hour, and now you're paying 8 cents a kilowatt hour for the power purchase agreement. That rate can either be fixed over the entire term of the agreement, in which case it might cost you a little more, it might be 9 cents, or it could have an escalator, and that escalator is going to make that cost go up incrementally over time. Escalators in these agreements are usually between 1% and 3%, and that can magnify. So you want to make sure that if you have an escalator, you're feeling confident that the cost of electricity from your utility company is going to go up faster than the cost of your solar financing or your solar rates. So stuff to keep in mind there. Again, that stuff's all on our website as well, and recommend you read through the fine print like any other agreement. One thing I forgot to mention for loans as well is make sure if you're sourcing your own, you may want to check whether there are any penalties for prepayment, especially with SRECs. If you decide to really load that up and make sure that you pay it off early, you just want to make sure you don't have any penalties for that. And then this last item here, I'm not going to mention because it's not really relevant to DC, but if you happen to know folks who are in rural areas, there's some really good financing from the federal government to support farmers and rural businesses. All right, so what is next? The link that Jasenia chatted is also here. DC Go Solar / DC Go Solar is going to take you to that sign up page. If you'd like to join the group, we'd love to have you. You'll get lots of personalized communication from us about what's going on. And we would love to see you go solar through this group and give us your feedback on it as well. This is something that is new for us, but we would very much like to make sure that is providing all the value that you would expect from Solar United Neighbors, and that we're really helping you ultimately install solar, get a good system, and that you start taking advantage of all those great incentives and all that renewable energy value from generating electricity right on your roof. Anybody have any other questions? Right on. I'm going to leave that up. So if folks want to stick around, if you want to unmute or ask a question out loud, you're welcome to do that. We can stick around and have questions, question time for anybody who wants to. So we'll just leave this open for a couple of minutes. And if everybody's good, then I will be sending out a recording to this to everybody as well, if you'd like to take a look and review it later on. And feel free to reach out to us. DC team at solarunitedneighbors.org is where you can find us, and you'll get to me that way and Jasenia.
I'd like to make a comment in terms of some of the things that you've shown.
Yeah, go right ahead.
One of the things, I'm just as some background for everybody else. I own a solar array on my house, and I keep very, very close tabs on my investment, two, my SRECs and my electric bill over time. And I think one of the things that really has a lot of impact is to show real world results in terms of what people can in fact save. All right, now one of the things that I did when I developed my own spreadsheet for this, I looked at my last 3 years of electric bills. I said, okay, that's my average electric bill on a monthly basis. And then I took I took that figure and applied that against what my new electric bills had become, and found that in my case, where I had an average annual electric bill of almost $1,900, I was saving anywhere from $1,300 to $1,500 just on the electricity alone, year over year.
Nice.
That does not include the SREC income, which is tremendous. The system that's on my particular house is an 8.2 kilowatt system. The panels that were installed at the time were the highest efficiency I could afford. That has paid me back in spades. And that's very important, because if you think about panel efficiency, if I install a panel that is 21% efficient and somebody else installs a panel that is 19% efficient, I'm actually producing not 2% more than my neighbor, I'm producing 10% more, because it's the difference in the amount of electricity that is being used. So if I'm producing 10% more, I'm getting that much more in terms of megawatt, kilowatt production and SREC revenue. And that SREC revenue is so very important to an investment in DC. So if you can afford to buy your system, my recommendation is you buy your system. But anything you do is going to save you money, is another point to understand with this.
Thanks, Russ. That's a really good point. And I will note that even back in 2012, I did the same thing to find the highest performance module I could budget for that same reason. So yeah, that's really great suggestions. Anybody else have any questions or anything to share? Or Russ, go ahead if you have something else.
To say, I think you covered a lot of really good ground for people this evening. And I think it's important that people really do their homework. And I know that Solar United has a lot of great resources for people that are trying to get their arms around this, because there is a lot to understand. And you know, working with when I did this, I had to do it on my own. And fortunately, I had very good salespeople that I worked with, and I really took them to task in terms of getting information. But having a resource like Solar United Neighbors is just a fantastic resource, and I can't say enough of. And I've looked at your website extensively and participated in other panels and forums. I think what you're doing is a great service.
Thank you, Russ. I really appreciate that. And for folks that have, I think to Russ's point, if you get stuck and you're not sure where to find something, just send us an email. You'll get to me, you'll get to Jasenia. We'll point you in the right direction. We want to make sure people go through this process, and it's as simple for them as it can be, considering, as you said, that there can be some things to sort of get up to speed on. So we want to make that accessible for people. So thank you.
Yeah, our number one goal is to help educate people and consumers about the process of going solar, so you can make the best decision that works for you.
Well, thanks everybody for joining. As I said, we'll send out a recording of the presentation, and we really appreciate you spending an hour of your time with us this evening. So thank you again, and have a great evening.
Thanks.